Last week at the end of class, we were talking a little bit about Solomon's portico, how it was the only part of the temple that Herod did not raise. He actually reused it to save money, probably because it was in good condition. Of course, the church met there. Other things in the gospel that are spoken of, Jesus walking there during the Feast of the Dedication in the wintertime. But one more thing tonight, kind of covering loose ends before we get to the Court of the Women, which we want to spend most of our time tonight on. And that is the Tower of Antonio. I told you earlier that it had been built before the time of Herod. It was actually built during the time of the high priest John Hyrcanus, who was the leader of the people between the Testaments. He lived in the 2nd century before Christ, as a place for soldiers to stay to guard the temple. So Herod improved upon it, increased its size. There's a lot of controversy about not only where it was, but actually what it was. Some people think that because Romans always built their army camps the same way, that it had to be that way, but Josephus always refers to it as a tower. He does say it had 4 turrets on the corners, one of which overlooking the northwest corner of the temple was 70 cubits high, so it was over 100 feet. And the other towers were shorter than the one that overlooked the corner of the temple. It was connected to the temple underground, and maybe from the record in Acts, if that was the stairs into the tower that they were trying to get Paul up when he asked to speak, it may have been connected by stairs too. But just don't know very much about it, except it was increased in size and it was overlooking the temple. It was also the place where the high priest's vestments were kept. They were not kept in the temple itself proper. The high priest's vestments were kept in the Tower of Antonio for whatever reason, security or whatever. But that is enough about the outlying areas, unless you have some questions that we can cover at this time. I have a short video tonight, which is kind of a bird's eye view of the holy place and the temple, all from one end to the other. I think this came from a Mormon site, like all the videos we've seen before, and probably all the ones we'll ever see again. There's some things about it that are inaccurate, and a lot of it is just imagination, but it has some illustrations of things I wanted you to see. It starts out, you see, it starts out in the royal portico, then moves toward the sanctuary on the south side. That's supposed to be the Tower of Antonia. By the rounded stairs, of course, you know this is the Nicanor gate into the court of the priests and of Israel. And you notice it shows the front of the temple as covered with gold, which most people disagree with. This room with the fire, I don't know for sure what it is. This is the waterworks that we just went by. This is supposed to be in the Holy of Holies, and that's supposed to be the veil into the most holy place. But the nice thing about this is this great final view here. One thing I like about that particular video, and it's so short you can watch it many times and see something different. If you notice carefully, as it was showing the inner courtyards, the Court of the Women and the other courtyard, it just doesn't have a plain wall with gates in it, but has actually the wall being made up of several different buildings, each of which, in the artist drawing here, is of a different height. Some of them protrude from the others, just not a blank wall with gates. And whether that is an accurate representation of everything, it is certainly true of 2 of the buildings, one in the northeast corner of the court of the priests, the other in the southwest corner of the court of the priests. Those two buildings we know stuck out from the rest of the buildings that surrounded that court and actually protruded into the area that was not considered holy, or was very close to it in the case of the one in the southwest corner. But if you have your road map, but we want to actually start tonight in the court of the women on the lower right-hand corner of your drawing. Does everyone still have one? There are some more copies back there if you don't. This is a road map, and this is a plan you're going to need to follow where we are. If you start on the lower right, that would be the northeast corner. The total gray area here is representing the area inside that fence that we talked about last week that no Gentile could go beyond. Now, right inside the fence, and the drawing is approximately to scale, but as much to be desired as far as being completely scale. But inside that fence, it was just outside the steps. There were 12 steps that went up to the sacred platform. Now, that is the temple, starting with those steps, or at the top at least. That is the actual holy area and all that we've talked about up to this point. All those courtyards, all those buildings, all the gates. Now we're into the area where worship was conducted and where the Jews considered it to be holy ground. So if we start in that lower right-hand corner, you will see over to the right, this is the court of the women, surrounded by a yellow square, as it was almost square, which represents the fact that there was a colonnade around the court of the women, at least on three sides. What in between it and the court of Israel, a little bit more iffy. But there were at least a U-shaped colonnade around this court. And in the lower right-hand corner, the southeast corner, you'll see that building is labeled wood. Now, these are called chambers. They were not rooms. They were like a Roman villa. That is, you had four walls with doors, and you had a portico with an open area in the middle, like a patio or something like the Romans would do, even private villas. So it's really just a walled area with a great big hole in the roof. And so these chambers, this one was the chamber of the wood. Now some priest that had been injured or for some reason was not fit to offer sacrifice and participate in the worship inside the court of the priest would be given the job to go through all the wood hauled into the temple and to sort out all the wood that had wormholes in it. If a piece of wood had a wormhole in it, they would not use it to keep the great altar fire burning. And so he sorted the wood in this, and so it's a chamber of wood. And of course, you had to keep the fire burning day and night. It was never to go out. And so in wintertime and times of bad weather, when you couldn't get wood into the temple, you had to keep a store, some sort of storage, a certain amount of wood there all the time, just in case you had weather or something and could not get wood into the temple. So that's the chamber of wood. Now, we're going to go counterclockwise. You see right above it, you see a chamber, and it's the same sort of thing. It's four walls with a great big hole in the roof with a colonnade, and so it's an open air chamber, and that's the chamber of the Leopards. Now, in between those two chambers, on the north side and on the south side, the green in my code represents a gate. These gates, there are four you see on each side, four on the north, four on the south, that were called gates. There apparently were other openings, doors, but these are the gates where the public would go in and out. Josephus says they had marble columns on each side. They were at least two-story. There were chambers over the gate, and in some cases we know what the chambers were used for as we move into the court of the priest. But the green in this drawing is gates. Yellow represents colonnades or porticos with a roof where people could stand or sit. A lot of the areas had stone benches, you might say, along the walls so you could sit. and in the shade out of the sun. So we have a gate on the north, and these gates, unlike the other gates, have no names. They're just called the north and the south gates to the court of the women. Okay, we go there and we go past that north gate, and we have the chamber of the lepers. Now, what do you suppose happened in the chamber of the lepers? If a person had leprosy and he thought he was cured, they came in, and I'm not sure which gate they came through. There was a gate on the north side of the temple, on the west side of the temple, which instead of having a flat lintel, had a pointed lintel. It looks like something the Mayans might have done. It had, instead of flat across, it had two huge stones forming the lintel. This was a private gate, and I have read that at least at one time or the other, that people that thought they had leprosy and had been cured entered by that gate. And that was the reason for the pointed lintel, because it was not a public entrance. It was more or less private. And you might wonder, well, if you're going to go to this chamber to have the priest pronounce you clean of your leprosy, why wouldn't you come in by the nearest gate, which is right there next door? And that's a good question. So what gate a person coming to be declared clean of leprosy came in all the time, I'm not sure. But could have come in here, could have come in by the gate that was on the west side behind the sanctuary. Anyway, what happened in this chamber of the lepers? Well, if you had leprosy and you had been cured, you appeared before a priest, and the priest said, thumbs up or thumbs down. You're either cured or no, you aren't. I suspect there was some sort of inspection that if you weren't cured, you didn't get this far. But this is where the official pronouncement was made. Probably you didn't get past the gate if you still had it. But this is where the official pronouncement that you were cured of leprosy, and you'd be told then to go offer the sacrifices, which the law required on such an occasion. So that's the chamber of the lepers. Okay, are we good? Okay, now let's go across the Nicanor gate. You've got the semicircular staircase. There were 13 steps from the court of the women to the court of Israel, which lay beyond. Now, the court of Israel should have been called the landing strip of Israel, because you see that turquoise strip along there? That is the court of Israel. Everything else belonged to the priest. And so you could not have very many men inside the court of Israel, because it was about 10 cubits or 11 cubits wide and ran across that eastern part of the court of Israel and the priests there. So it was just a strip of land, but of courtyard. But when you think about it, what are you going to do if you're going there? You may be going to offer a sacrifice, and so what happened with sin offerings? Well, a sin offering, if it was an animal other than a bird, the one on whose behalf it was offered, was the one that slit the throat of the animal. So if you had business there as a man, you would not be in that area long. The really public area was the area we call the court of the women. Now, strange fact, women could enter the court of Israel. And we'll talk about it next week, but if you look on your road map here, the middle gate in the court of the priest is labeled what? The women's gate. First time I saw this in a drawing, I thought, everybody knows women can't go into the court of the priest. They could. If they had a sacrifice which they wanted to present, they could go into the court of the priest with their sacrifice through the women's gate. Now, not shown on here, there was a door somewhere along that wall that separated the court of Israel from the court of the women, and that portico there in that northwest corner. There was a door there, so a woman could go in the one gate, present her sacrifice that she was bringing to offer, and then go through that door back into the court of the women. There were provisions. In most cases, women didn't do that. It was the nature of society in those days, but it was permissible. But let's go back to the court of the women. If we go across the Nicanor gate, over on the left-hand side, which of course would be south, we have the chamber of the oil and the wine. The oil that was used for preparing the incense, the wine that was used in the service and the drink offerings, and some other things that were required for the incense would be stored here. So it was just called the chamber of the oil and the wine. And again, you had to keep a supply on hand. So it was kept in that chamber. And notice then, between it and the final Nazarite, which pardon my spelling, in English is N-A-Z-I or N-A-Z-A, and I hit the E key, I see. But there's a gate then on that side between separating those two chambers. And so the final of the four chambers of the court of the women is the chamber of the Nazarites. Now the Nazarites, when their vow was completed, they would come to the temple. If you read the Old Testament, they would come to the temple and their hair would be cut there. And part of the hair, they had to offer the sacrifices on the altar of burnt offerings, and part of the hair was thrown into the fire on the altar of burnt offerings, along with their sacrifice. In this chamber, they would cut their hair here, and also that sacrifice that was prepared, part of it would be boiled here, as they were to eat part of their sacrifice. And so what I've read, they would boil part of the sacrifice that they were to eat in this chamber, and also throw some of the hair into the fire here, apparently. Whether that was required of the Lord is something they did. It's what they apparently did in this chamber. So that's what you did if your vow was completed and you came, you offered the sacrifice, and you cut your hair and offered the sacrifice. Now, what about the men in the book of Acts that Paul was asked when he was suspected of or accused of stirring up trouble and not following the customs? What about the men in Acts where he was told and asked if he would pay for their sacrifices? They had a vow. What was the case in the book of Acts? Did they go in the temple and cut their hair? No, it was 8 days of purification. They cut their hair at home. Anybody know what that means? It means somehow they had violated their Nazarite vow. Somebody fell dead next to them or something. And when you did that, you had to go and offer a sin offering and a peace offering. And then your vow started all over again, when you violated your vow. And if you read carefully the Old Testament records and I never noticed it before, what a Nazarite was to do, you started all over again. When something happened to you and you became unclean and you violated your vow of separation. And of course, the most common thing might be a death or something like that would make you unclean. So in the case of the men in the book of Acts, they apparently something had happened to them. We're not told what, but they cut their hair at home, and then they went to temple to go through offer the sacrifices, and presumably to start their vow all over again. Okay, that is pretty much the court of the women. Let me stop and let you ask questions. Don't guarantee I can answer them. A lot went on here. This was the place where most of the events in the temple, as far as the great deal of mass of the people was concerned, this is where it happened. Now you notice in the video, if you go home and look where you can stop it there are 4 LED light poles in the court of the women on that video. They look like in the video, they're 100 feet high, and each light pole has 4 LED lights on it. Now, in the Feast of the Tabernacles, the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Ingathering, the Feast of the Harvest time in the fall, it was the feast. The Jews often They didn't call the Passover the feast. They didn't call Pentecost the feast. The feast to the Jews was the Feast of Booths, because the crops are in, everybody goes to Jerusalem, and you have a week of festivity and sacrifice. That was, of course, the great festival where the hundreds of animals were slaughtered during the 8 days. But one night, I think it's the last night of the feast, the evening of the next to last day, they had a ceremony at night in the court of the women, and they brought in giant lampstands. But that video has them 100 feet high. You'd have to have an angel filling them with oil. But they brought in giant lampstands to light the court of the women during that special night of the Feast of Tabernacles. And of course, they were oil lamps. And anyone know what they used for wicks? They used priest garments. Those were used strips of worn out priest vestments. Garments were cut into strips and used as wicks in those giant lamp stands that they brought in. And so they had this great party at night. Now, this was such a great feast, and this was more popular than Pentecost or Passover in many respects. They had special ledges built along the wall of that colonnade. During the Feast of Tabernacles, they put flooring across in the colonnade and made bleachers just to have room for people to be able, especially women, to be up, and they actually built risers after they laid boards across and made this temporary floor. They built risers up so people could sit and could look down at the festivities that were going on in the court of the women during the Feast of Booths. And when the feast was over, they took everything down, stored it away till next year. But they had the lamps, they lit the courtyard, and at the very west end, you know, that Nicanor gate. This gate and the temple gates along here on the side were 10 cubits wide, which would be about 16 and a half feet. 10 cubits wide, 20 cubits high, 32 feet. It said the Nicanor gate was Corinthian brass. All the other gates along the sides, as I told you last week, were donated by a by name of Alexander from Alexandria, Egypt. They were precious metal covered with gold and silver. The Nicanor gate was so expensive, it was made of what was called brass. It did not tarnish, and it was not adorned with gold or silver. It was just left shiny in its natural state. It said it took 20 men, that gate was so massive and so heavy, it's metal, 20 men to open it. Keys to the temple, and I'll tell you later where they put them at night. They had a place in the floor, but that's for next week. But the Nicanor gate was left unadorned with gold or silver, unlike the other of the great gates, 4 on each side around the 2 courtyards. But as we go through that Nicanor gate, if we finally find 20 healthy people that can get the thing open. Now, I've told you before, the standard step in the temple was a half cubit. Sometime during the intertestamental time, something happened. They did not, in the second temple as was built by Zerubbabel and the courtyard here, they did not have that low fence that separated the court of Israel from the priest's area. Something happened, and they decided they would put up, and so again, not a large fence, just enough fence to know that you don't, that it's there and that there's a distinction. This is apparently the only place in Herod's temple where the first cubit, it was a whole cubit. So if you're going to leave the court of Israel to go up into the court of the priest, it's one giant step first. There were 3 steps apparently, but the first one was a whole cubit. Now you think of a step 20 inches high. It was a giant step. But there was a low wall along there that separated the court of of Israel from the court of the priest. So the priest will be officiating. But as you go through the Nicanor gate, this is probably where Simeon and where Mary brought Jesus to be, the firstborn male was dedicated to God, and it was probably the priestly blessing would have been given here at this gate. And of course, Simeon was there and knew that God had fulfilled his promise that he would see the Christ before he died. But if you go through that massive gate, you've got the court of Israel ahead, 3 steps, one of which is a giant step. But the Nicanor gate is separated from the court of the women by 13 steps. Now, in the book of Psalms, how many Psalms of Ascent are there? Would you like to guess? There are 13. Yeah. During Pentecost festivities, the Levitical singers would sing the 13 songs of ascent on those 13 steps. Now, what I don't know, if they sang number 1 on step number 1 and moved up to 2 till they finally sang the 13th one on the 13th step. I don't know that. But you can read everywhere they sang the 13 Psalms of Ascent on those 13 steps that separated the court of the women from the court of Israel through the Nicanor gate. Here again, the Nicanor gate was roofed over. It was not just a gate and a wall. Nobody knows exactly what was above it, but Josephus says the gates were all roofed, and you could sit in the shade under them on the steps. So if you make it through that gate, you're looking at the court of Israel ahead, and beyond it, the altar and the temple. But let's go right and left of the Nicanor gate. On the right-hand side, this is that somewhere on the right-hand side of that Nicanor gate, there was a chamber called the Chamber of Phineas. Remember David, when the priests increased in number, so many priests, that David made shifts or courses of priests, 24. And so the Chamber of Phineas was the locker room. There were 4 different classes of priests and priestly garments. So the Chamber of Phineas had 4 times 24, 96 lockers, storage rooms, whatever, where each course of the 24 courses of priests stored their vestments. So when they were not serving in the temple, this is where they were stored till it came their turn, and they came to do their assigned duty for however long it was. They would go to the Chamber of Phineas, and there would be where they would find their vestments that they would need for the service while they were there. On the other side of the gate, if you remember from studying the law, there were meat offerings, there were grain offerings, there were drink offerings. One of the requirements for the grain offering was what? Well, this was called the room of the pancake makers, because in this room, those cakes of grain and olive oil that were required to be offered in sacrifices on the altar, this is where they made the pancakes to be used in the temple service on the left-hand side of the gate of Nicanor as you go into the priestly area. Question? I know it just goes on and on. Okay, you ready to go further? Okay, straight ahead you see on the left, you see the great altar. Now, and all of this gold and silver and brass and marble and tiles, flooring that was unbelievably expensive, the altar itself was of unhewn stones, field stones, never been touched by a tool, never squared. They were unhewn stones. The altar stood on a square about 50 feet square, the platform that it stood on. It was, and I don't have, my memory does not supply the number I need. It was about 15 feet high, something like, I think, 11 cubits high. So you have a huge altar on a huge platform way up in the air. How are we going to get the priest up there with all the offerings? How are we going to get the wood up there to keep the fire going? Well, on the left, you see that orange rectangle. It was a ramp. It was not steps, it was a ramp. And the priest climbed up to that platform, to the altar, by that ramp that was on the left side of it. You see behind the altar and the ramp, there's a blue circle. That was the laver before the priest did certain things, went into the temple. Of course, they washed their what? They got the water there. What did they have to do? They had to wash their hands and their feet. And so they would have leather sandals on for a lot of the service. But at certain times of the service, they took those sandals off and washed their feet and left the sandals off until the service was completed. And so you can imagine in the wintertime, Jerusalem has an elevation of about 3,600 feet. It could get cold. And you've got a lot of cold stone flooring. One thing they always did, throw this in here for just, they always, in the service, the priest always made right turns. If he was facing the people and to turn around, he made a right-hand turn. If he was facing the sanctuary and wanted to turn back toward the people, he made right-hand turns. They always turned right, never turned left. Just little things like that, you know. And if you didn't do it, if you forgot it, well, then you were in a lot of trouble. But there were all kinds of regulations that went far beyond, of course, that anything you'll read in the Old Testament and the law, in the books of the law, as what they would do. But they had all these different customs which they were expected to learn and to do. Well, we've gotten into the court and we're ready to proceed further in the court of the priests. But since we don't have very much time, let's just stop and give you a chance to ask any questions, and then we'll continue. We've got the altar, and we've got the ramp, and we've got a priest up the ramp. There was somewhere inside once you read the 3 steps into the court of the priest, there was another platform of 3 steps, and when the Levites sang during the service inside the court of the priest, the Levites stood on this platform that was 3 steps above the level of the rest of the court of the priest. And sometimes, I think I'm correct in saying this, when the priest would do the blessing from Numbers chapter 4, the words that we sing to the 7-fold Amen. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord have his countenance look down upon you, give you peace. Yes, sir. Before they did that blessing, if the priest had his sandals on, he took them off before that. If there was a priest anywhere in the courtyard that for some reason was not, for whatever reason, acceptable or thought himself unacceptable, there was a signal given. All descendants of Aaron, when the signal was given, were expected to follow whoever was giving the blessing to the people before the service ended. They were expected to participate. So the signal was given, and if you were a priest that had something on your conscience or something that was otherwise unacceptable, you were expected to leave the court before the blessing was given. The priest giving the blessing would climb the 3 steps, apparently to the same platform that the Levites sang upon, and give the blessing. In the temple worship, all the priests were expected to raise their hands above their head and praise during the blessing. And later times when or outside the temple, you only had to raise your hands like this to shoulders. Just another detail they had to remember. But if you were inside the temple itself and the blessing was given, you raised your hands as high as you could toward heaven. All kinds of details. And then you understand when you read about what they did and the rules they made, why, of course these are innocuous, but in certain cases why Jesus would say you void the commandment of God with your traditions, because in many cases later on they did, especially the rabbi that decided after the temple was destroyed, well, we will continue to worship God. We don't have temple, we don't have sacrifices, but he made the rules now. It's called rabbinic Judaism. There's no temple, there's no bloody sacrifice, but we're still going to worship God, and we're going to have a Day of Atonement, etc. And of course, that sort of thing was going on at the time of Jesus, but they still had the temple then. Any questions? Okay, if you get a chance, go back and look at the video on your computer at home when Norris gets it posted, and you will see, besides the gates on each side, many of these side buildings, once we get into the court of the priest, apparently had doors. And when we see what they did in those small rooms and buildings between the six gates on the court of the priest, you'll understand why they might want to have a door outside for those rooms. And we'll talk about those next week.